And I want to thank everybody for joining us today. This is actually the third session in our virtual annual symposium. And today we are actually going to be talking about partnering with policymakers. And we are very privileged to have with us Mr. Paul Dufour. So born in Montreal and educated at McGill, the University of Montreal, and Concordia University in the history of science and science policy, Paul Dufour has been senior advisor in science policy with several Canadian agencies and organizations over the last 35 years. This includes being senior program specialist within the International Development Research Center and interim executive director at the former office of the National Science Advisor to the Canadian government. He is a member of the Science and Policy Exchange Board, as well as the MITAC Science Policy Fellows Advisory Board. Mr. Dufour was an investment committee member for Grand Challenges Canada on global health for several years and has practical S&T policy experience for over 3 decades, having been with such bodies as the Science Council of Canada, Ministry of State for Science and Technology, Foreign Affairs, and Special Advisor to the Prime Minister's Advisory Council on S&T. Dufour leads lectures regularly on science policy, has authored numerous articles on international S&T relations and Canadian innovation policy. He is a series co-editor of the Carter Mill Guides to World Science and is the author of the Canadian chapter for the UNESCO 2015 Science Report. More recently, he has co-edited books on the history of the Science Council of Canada with Jeff Kinder and the value of science in society and culture with Agnes Hertzberg. So with further ado, Mr. Paul Dufour, I'm going to hand it to you. Thanks again for joining us.
Merci, Linda, and bonjour, everyone. Good afternoon, good morning, depending on the time zone. It's my privilege to be here as well to give you a bit of an overview of, I guess, the whole issue about policy making and partnerships. I'm going to try to keep this rather informal as much as possible. I'm not a true academic, so what you're going to hear from me are stories, narrative, around why it's important to think about the work that you're doing in the context of public policy in the wider sphere of things. I'm not a public health expert, though I've had experience in that field with an organization that Linda referred to. But I do want to talk about my broader background in the area of science, public policy, and decision making. Because the first word of this seminar starts with P, I'm going to structure my presentation around the partnering aspects, the policy issues, personal stories, positive skills, and then some programs and platforms which I think are going to be helpful and useful to a number of you. Now, I've read some of your CVs. Linda was kind enough to send me some of your backgrounds. So it's an eclectic group that's got a very wide-ranging set of interests, I'm sure. And I welcome the opportunity to have a conversation with you about some of the issues I am going to raise. To begin with, I'm kind of a retired person. I help out and do a lot of mentoring these days. I'm essentially rewiring myself in many ways. And I'm spending some more time on Zoom chats of this kind. So it's great to be able to do this with this very interesting group that you have. And I'm sorry we weren't able to get together in real time, in real person earlier this year, but we'll make do with this. Feel free to interrupt me as I open up and discuss some of the issues associated with the interface between public policy, partnerships, and research and knowledge. And I'll try to, respond accordingly. Let me begin by just saying that we're in a very interesting part of public policy these days, given what's going on the COVID-19 response. There's enormous tensions in the public policy sphere right now, but we're fortunate in the sense that evidence and science and the use of data are being seen as critical to getting us out of this particular pandemic crisis. I think that's a big plus. And we have a federal administration in this country, as well as provincial administrations, that are actually quite interested in understanding how science, evidence, data, knowledge is actually being used and can be used to be able to solve many of the issues associated with the COVID response. And these are varied, of course, from mental health issues, which are increasing series of issues around the COVID response, but also, of course, around the technology behind it, the various platforms, the diagnostics, therapeutics, vaccines, medical supplies, etc. These are all issues that science and the work that you're doing, I think, are being seen in a very, very positive light, which means that it's a great opportunity to be able to step outside a little bit more of your bubbles, your respective bubbles, we all have bubbles, and move into trying to interest our policymakers writ large, be they at the provincial, territorial, federal, or municipal levels, in the use of knowledge and data. I don't have to tell you, though, that of course, the very nature of science and the production of science and research is changing. It's now people are actually referring to fast science as a new term. We're getting preprints of publications that are no longer being peer reviewed in the same way that they used to be. With that has positives and negatives to it, of course. There are lots of retractions going on because of the speed at which some of this is taking place. There's also, of course, a big impact that's taking place around our labs around the country, some of which are shut down, access to information and to the research equipment also being constrained to some extent. So we're in a very interesting time, to say the least. We also have, of course, an international environment where a lot of this information is now being transmitted at light speed right through to around the globe, and people are picking up the latest information as much as they can and use that information in their own specific contexts. Along with that, of course, are the shadows associated with the publications and the research knowledge production, and that is the whole issue around misinformation, disinformation, and there's a lot of attention being paid to how to filter through the incredible amounts of information that are being generated out of this, but also the misinformation through particularly social media, but also through other channels as well. So all of this is challenging our public policymakers who are trying to react in real time, don't have time to vet everything, of course, are heavily reliant on what it is you're doing in terms of the research production and the information and the data that's being generated. So it is making for a very interesting period in our history, to be honest. This is a unique time. I haven't, people refer to a lot of historical events, but I haven't seen the scale and the scope in which this is taking place in previous times. Although one, of course, often hears about the comparison to SARS, the SARS outbreak in the early 2000s, but, you know, and also, of course, globally around other issues associated with the Ebola outbreaks, which is, by the way, resurfacing to some extent in parts of Africa. But this is coming at us with a scale, scope, and speed that we're not simply used to. And so understanding how to better filter the information, how to communicate it, is becoming a very important job. So that's what I wanted to say a little bit about, you know, the whole notion about where public policy space and sphere is. And I'm sure you're all in the business of trying to disseminate your research, broadcast the information and the data to your colleagues through your various networks. But there are various channels out there now that would make this much more easily available to you, and I'll speak to that in a bit later. My personal background in this area has taken many twists and turns, and I thought I'd mention a couple of stories that I think will bring to the fore why it's important to be very entrepreneurial about what it is you're trying to do to be able to communicate to public policymakers and link up with some of the work that they're trying to make some decisions around. The case I want to refer to took place in 2004. I was working at the time with an organization called the International Development Research Center. This is an organization that's based here in Canada, but which operates around the world, providing assistance to develop capacity for research in the developing world. It is this year 50 years old, so it's having some celebrations associated with its activities. But I was doing a lot of work around research capacity building, and particularly in Africa. I was called into a meeting by the new national science advisor that had been just appointed by the Prime Minister at the time, Paul Martin. Mr. Martin had asked his science advisor at the time if he could prepare a plan around which 5%, up to 5%, of Canada's total expenditures in research could be devoted to the solutions and needs of global health issues around the world. It was an interesting proposal because the Prime Minister at the time, Mr. Martin, was very interested in the global environment and Canada's role in providing development assistance, particularly around the issue of health. I received this call from the National Science Advisor's Office to join him and help with, because of my work at IDRC, to help him on particularly this particular theme. It was a very interesting time. We put together a whole bunch of policy briefs around the issue. We did some data analysis. What was the extent of and the scale and scope of Canada's research and development around the world in this area? What would it take to spend X amount, and what should it be devoted to? Along the line of developing this, we received a proposal from two very entrepreneurial medical doctors who came to us with a proposal, and that proposal was called Energizing Our Foreign Policy Influence, Canada Science International, a proposal to create a new structure, a new organization, if you will, that would address the issues of how Canada can best use its assets in research in the health field, particularly, to assist the capacity building questions in the developing world, which included, by the way, at the time, HIV/AIDS, malaria, tuberculosis. These are the big issues, but then, morphed into other areas around obesity, mental health, chronic diseases, etc. And this proposal was put forward by two enterprising scholars and entrepreneurs from the University of Toronto. Some of you may know them. One was Peter Singer, the other was Abdullah Dar, both of them working at the Joint Center for Bioethics at the University of Toronto at the time, both very interested in this whole field. Abdullah Dar is now has been doing some work on science advice with the United Nations, and Peter Singer is now a special advisor at the World Health Organization. But this particular proposal in 2004 got some attention, and then there was a change in government in 2007, 2008. The new government came on board. Peter Singer and Abdullah Dar continued to promote the idea, the concept behind this new organization. And it eventually saw the light of day through something called Grand Challenges Canada. Some of you may be familiar with this organization. It's based in Toronto. And in 2010, it received quite a chunk of money from the federal government at the time to move forward around creating this new organization that would deal with bold solutions to wicked problems in the global health field, but that it would provide funding with Canadian funds in partnership, smart partners with other organizations around the world, which included at the time the Gates Foundation, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, which had been working very diligently and investing enormous sums of money around this issue. And it also included other organizations like World Vision and the Red Cross and other foundations around the world to leverage all that funding to try to find solutions to a whole series of these wicked problems that take place in the global health sphere. You can look them up on the website at grandchallenges.ca. They've been doing some very interesting work, and I mentioned this whole story because I was always very interested in what they were trying to do, and I did get involved in being a member of their investment committee up until a year and a half ago. What they've been trying to do around grand challenges in the global health sphere has been, I think, quite remarkable. Over 10 years now, they've invested quite a significant sum of money. Over almost 2,000 innovations have come out of these partnerships that they've created with the developing country players, as well as, of course, all these foundations. In particular, maternal and child health care have been a particular focus for this group. Saving lives at birth, every woman, every child, the UN program, all of them have been connected to trying to address some of these issues associated with that. So it's an interesting story of how particularly a public policy proposal from two scientists emerged at a time when Canada was looking to create something that was novel, bold, unique in the field, but that was going to leverage new opportunities with partners around the world. And it's the kind of thing that points to the interest that certain academics and researchers can have in trying to develop a particular venture, initiative, experiment, call it what you will, that I think we need more of it these days in terms of what's been going on in the current pandemic response. I've been also very much involved in helping another group much more recently, and this is a group that Canada's current Chief Science Advisor, Mona Niemer, some of you may know who she is. She's former Vice President, University of Ottawa and Research, very dynamic woman, has been working, was appointed a few years ago, 3 years ago now, by the Prime Minister to provide advice to the government. And she's taken on initially the task of looking at how government of Canada's science infrastructure can be better organized or orchestrated, if you will, around some fairly big themes and research infrastructure associated with that. She's also, of course, been asked to look at the whole issue around research, open science, the changing nature of science, and how federal science can be made more available, more easily available and accessible to the Canadian public. As part of that, she recently created a youth council. This is a a group of young scientists, researchers, students who were picked from, there's 20 of them, who were selected from an initial pool of 1,100 applications. It's quite a massive undertaken by her office, down to 20 people who are now looking at, been asked to help Dr. Niemer around issues associated with scientific literacy, issues of the associated with marginalization of populations in the research field, so gender, Black in STEM, for example, which is a very current one, other areas as well. I've been working with two others to help mentor this group of very engaged, passionate, young scholars and researchers who want to really make a difference. I'm using that as a segue because from my first experience with the National Science Advisor in the early 2000s to this current one, we're seeing slightly different approaches to how these kinds of partnerships can be created with much more engagement by the general public, if you will. The other area that I forgot to mention is that's growing in interest amongst this group is something called citizen science, where scientists are tapping, if you will, the general public, the informed public around issues associated with observing various things dealing with science and the research and the knowledge fields, and how the citizens can become more engaged themselves in understanding how science works, how it can be communicated, how it can be used for local decision making, et cetera, et cetera. So there's some very interesting trends that are developing that have emerged over that last 15 years or so, when I transitioned from one science advisor to helping a second one. So these have been very interesting experiments. I think Dr. Niemer is looking very much forward to, well, she's consumed right now by the COVID-19 response, and you may have seen on her website, she has, I think, about 11 task forces, expert panels currently on various aspects associated with COVID, including one, by the way, on children and the response or the impact on children from the COVID pandemic. There are a number of countries now looking at this whole issue associated with children, not just simply from the issue of transmission of the virus, but also around the issues associated with social integration, mental health, etc. So there's a lot of activity going on there, and I imagine a number of you here that are listening to this have been engaged in some aspects of that. In fact, it's almost hard to escape anything to do with the COVID response these days. So those are two short stories that I wanted to refer to you. One very current, which is ongoing. The other is a previous experience, but which created an organization which is still around now, celebrating its 10th anniversary this year, Grand Challenges Canada, and still working in a very interesting space around finding solutions using knowledge, evidence, data, research to solve some wicked health problems. I wanted to also raise something that is so important, and I've mentioned this to Susan and to Linda, that I think we tend to underestimate it when we're talking about understanding how to communicate what it is we're doing or how it is we're trying to influence decision makers. And that is the whole notion of the so-called soft skill. It's called writing. I spend a lot of time working and mentoring with students, telling them about how critically important it is to be able to communicate what it is you're doing in a simple, clear, concise, succinct way. This is, of course, built on my 40 years of working with policymakers, ministers, MPs, MPPs, trying to understand what it is that they can digest, make it accessible, and being able to write in a way that is exceedingly clear so that they can digest the information. Of course, it has to be followed up with other tools, but the writing skill, I think, is something I tell my students constantly, that if you ever have a chance to improve your writing skills, please do so, because you will definitely need it, irrespective of whether you think social media can do everything for you. Yes, it can do some things for you, but there's a lot more to it than that. And being able to communicate through effective writing, I've found, has been an important skill set. Being able to communicate it well, and of course to understand how public policy works, is also a critical aspect to this whole dimension of partnering with policymakers, right? So there are some groups in this country that have been trying to develop seminars, webinars on how to help with communication around the science and the evidence associated with this to policymakers. One of them is, by the way, we tend to forget them, but they're an important group. The journalists and the science media specialists in this country who are communicating through various fora, through various channels. There's a Science Media Center of Canada which does some training, tries to show, teach, train scientists, researchers on how to better articulate and communicate what it is they're trying to say to journalists through the media. Politicians, of course, spend a lot of time listening to and reading from journalists. That tends to be their prime source, actually, of information in many ways. So having scientists understand how to shape your research and messages in a way that the journalists and the media can pick it up is an important aspect to the whole issue of policy making and partnerships. So the Science Media Center, which has its base in Toronto, has been around now for about 10 years, 12 years. And they work with various media outlets, and they produce various updated news on breaking science, if you will. It's an interesting group that's been very helpful in the past. Another group that's been very useful around this issue, because it brings policymakers together to meet with the research community at large, is something called the Canadian Science Policy Conference. They're now into their 12th year. It's an annual event. It's coming. The next one is coming up in November. It'll be virtual. But it brings together most of the large public policy science research community organizations through various workshops, through various panels to discuss key themes around science, public policy, and decision making. If you haven't seen their website, sciencepolicy.ca, have a look at it. You'll see that they're preparing for the next conference. It's a fairly large conference. It'll be virtual, and there are many themes that may interest you. And it also, of course, as I mentioned, brings together ministers of research, science, health, etc. Also brings together research administrators, and it brings together the heads of the granting councils, for example. It's a very interesting conference. It's one of the better conferences in this field that takes place every year. There are also a growing interest in students across the country that I wanted to flag as well in this field, and that is there's a group in Montreal called the Science and Policy Exchange, SPE. These are grad students, postdocs, that have been holding over the last 10 years workshops science cafes with the public on topical issues which require, some input from the scientific community. They've had some on plastics, plastic waste, which is becoming a big issue. They've had some on mental health issues, on sexual harassment in the research area, etc. They're a very interesting group, very dynamic postdocs, graduate students from the Montreal area, mostly, but they're quite active, and they have a website that's got a newsletter. Again, they're tracking various aspects right now associated with the COVID-19 response from their perspectives, but again, it's a very interesting organization. And then there's a group called Evidence for Democracy, which was created in 2012 out of a particular protest movement that took place following the federal government's, at the time, under Mr. Harper, federal government's administration's policy around that period to muzzle scientists within government, i.e. not allowing the government scientists to speak to the science that they were producing, but having it filtered. This created quite a firestorm in Canada, not to mention globally. And there was a group in Ottawa, at the University of Ottawa, that created kind of a movement, which led to a huge march on the Hill, Parliament Hill, of a whole bunch of scientists, about 2,000 of them, in July 2012, that basically protested the fact that science was being, shall we say, muzzled, but not being publicized in the way that science as a public enterprise should be. So this led to the creation of a group called Evidence for Democracy, and they've been producing reports that deal with the whole issue of transparency, science integrity in the government, and the ability of scientists to move forward with publication of government research. They do other things as well, but it's an interesting group that has, would not have existed had it not been for a particular public policy issue that created this firestorm within Canada, and globally, of course. The global response to this was quite startling. A number of people were very concerned about what was going on in this country. So there's a lot of very interesting work going on with various groups, various platforms that are out there right now. I mentioned the Youth Council as well with Mona Niemer's group, but there's, of course, in Quebec, in Ontario, in other provinces, there are similar groups. Quebec's chief scientist, for example, has his own intersectoral student committee that provides him advice on various issues. In Toronto, at the University of Toronto, there's a Toronto Science Policy Network, which has been created by a very dynamic chemist who has been very much engaged on the public policy questions. So she's created this group called the Science Policy Network at University of Toronto. There are other groups as well in BC and Alberta. But I just wanted to give you a flavor for the fact that there's an emerging sense that the scientists, researchers, need to get out there and be a lot more public, an activist, if you will, with the knowledge that is being produced in the research that they're doing. I'm sure some of you are doing this, I have little doubt. Your virtual symposium is an attempt to try to do more of this, and your previous conferences have I think, brought a number of these issues to light as well. I wanted to finally say something about the whole question around what's next on the agenda, what's on the horizon that I see coming up. And I think, and I welcome your conversation around this. I think we're seeing a paradigm shift, if you will, for want of a better term, in the way, of course, in which knowledge is being produced. And by the way, when the different forms of knowledge, right? So let me be very clear here that I should have said from the get-go that when I use the word science, I mean it in its broadest sense. I also mean it from the point of view of the social sciences, the humanities, health sciences, of course, engineering, but indigenous knowledge, of course, traditional knowledge. These are all forms of knowledge now that are perfectly legitimate within this emerging space that we now call science and public policy. And I think we always have to be attentive to the fact that partnerships amongst these various interdisciplinarity groups is an important function of making sure that the science and research you're doing actually gets results. The days of siloed science are gone, long gone. And I think we need to be very clear about the fact that the greater the mix of these knowledges, the better it will be for not just the field itself or the enterprise, but also, of course, for society writ large. So I wanted to make that point. It's an important one. And we're starting to see our universities pay more attention to it, and our colleges. We're starting to see the research community globally understand that this is important. But it's also important to understand that because sciences are a global enterprise, by definition, it's global. It has a powerful possibility to create new partnerships with other countries, regions around the world. So there's an emerging field called science diplomacy, which has been created as a result of a number of champions, if you will, from around the world who are seeing science as a way of getting over traditional boundary disputes, if you will. So you can think, for example, about the Israeli-Palestinian issues that exist today geopolitically. It's still a huge issue. But there's a lot of cooperation going on, for example, around water and access to water and aquifers and so on between those regions, simply because the scientists themselves are communicating. For those of you who may not be aware of it, there's a group called the Science and Diplomacy Network, which has been writing many articles, journals. There's an actual journal called Science and Diplomacy around various case studies of how this is working and how it should be working. And the COVID-19 response has actually triggered probably a larger opportunity for getting the scientific community to be much more engaged with our diplomats and people who make decisions around state policy, foreign affairs, and so on. So we're starting to see much more activity in that area, and I think that's going to be a helpful and hopeful trend, particularly given the assets that knowledge and science can bring to the decision-making capabilities on global issues. There's a G7 science ministers group that meets once a year. They've come out with a statement on the COVID response. It's published, suggesting a number of ways in which governments can themselves interact more actively, more quickly and more effectively around the issues associated with the science behind this pandemic. There's a G20 one as well. There's a number of other fora, which I could go into, but I just wanted to flag this science and diplomacy aspect to the partnership question, because I think increasingly, because of the global nature of science, you're starting to see a lot more influence of science decision-making and the use of knowledge for better cooperation across the globe. Of course, we have our issues. There are still some tensions around the world. No question about that. You can't dismiss those. But particularly around global health issues, we have a number of organizations, of course, that are incredibly active and have been for many, many years, that are trying to mobilize all of these incredible assets we have in our respective countries, regions around the world. So that's, I think, a helpful thing. And the other thing I wanted to just add is that there is built into the field of knowledge a certain capability for foresight, i.e. the ability to anticipate what can be coming, could be coming down the road, over the horizon. And I think, if anything, this COVID pandemic has created the need for all of us to start thinking about how do we better plan, how do we better foresee the next one. And for those of you who have been following the UK situation on science and public health responses to the pandemic, you will know that there has been a credible conflict taking place between a former science advisor and the current science advisory system in the UK. And part of that is as a function of the fact that the previous science advisor to government produced a very interesting report in 2006 called Infectious Diseases, the Next 25 Years, where he predicted that we're going to have another one, we better prepare for it. So there's been a very interesting debate within the UK research community around, well, why wasn't this taken seriously and why can't we do something about it? So you're starting to see a debate, and for those of you who may have seen the congressional testimony that's just taking place today in the United States by Mr. Fauci, the public health advisor to the government. He's delivered a statement, it's quite a strong statement, where he's argued that there's a need to start preparing for the next one, and we should start thinking about what that will take and how we can better track, trace, monitor, and tackle, what is going to be obviously forthcoming. I'm not talking about a second wave here. I'm talking about the next big, outbreak. And that we should have science behind all this, and that it should be integrated in the heart of government and heart of government decision making. So these are important dimensions to think about. Anyway, in our country, we need to do this as well. I think it's not just in the U.S. We need to do this elsewhere as well. And Canada is got a rich history and a rich infrastructure around this question, and we should try to better mobilize it. And I think you are all part of that potential for this forthcoming foresight that I think we're going to need. I think I'm going to, if you don't mind, Linda and Susan, stop right there because I could yammer on. But I do want to get views, comments, and other things from you talented people there. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Can you hear me?
Yep. Hi.
Thank you very much. I think the last two talks, both of them have been so apropos for our COVID-19 situation. And we thank you very much for joining us and giving us those stories to help us think about how our work can impact policy and the health and of our current generation and future generations. Thank you very much, Paul. So we have a number of trainees on the call. We have 16 minutes left in this video conference. I'd like those who are on the call to write in their questions. We'll read them out as we did last time. As Paul said, we have different trainees from different backgrounds. While everyone's thinking about these issues you discussed, I had a certain question for you. And that goes back to being an early career investigator, someone who is just starting out in this world as a researcher. How do we make deliberate steps towards making sure that our work is impactful in the global sphere, in the policy sphere. So think about the PhD student, think about the postdoc. I know you said that we will, I actually looked up the policy conference that you had mentioned. So those are points of intersection that students can take advantage of to open their eyes to the world of possibilities out there. Do you have any advice for someone at that stage on how to set up their project with a vision for changing or influencing policy in the future?
Well, I think there's nothing wrong about writing about it in any way, shape, or form. I would think about the ability that you can have to use blog posts, for example, to talk about what it is you're doing, and posting your blog posts else beyond your bubble. It's important for others to understand that what you're doing, what you're trying to do, and what you're trying to do in terms of impact with your research goes well beyond what it is that your own network is all about. And so communicating that in some way, don't be shy. Use the tools, the social media tools that are available at the moment, try to do that. Also, go to these conferences, virtually or otherwise, that are slightly on the margins of what it is you're interested in, but you can get exposure to, a wider net, and you can have impact into that wider net. And then I made the point earlier, but it's so important. Understand how government works. It's a complicated organization. It's a huge enterprise. Understand, how that network operates, and try to understand some of the key players that are involved in that network, if you will. I think those are important aspects to it.
And I see Eric has a question, but before I go to that, I just wanted to encourage all the trainees on the call today. Is Dr. Mona Niemer was a researcher at the University of Ottawa, and the goal of this program is to help individuals like yourself on the call to be the next Chief Science Policy Advisor of Canada. And that is the dream we have for all of you, or to be in the global sphere advising presidents and prime ministers about the future of health for children and for all of us. So I want you to take what Paul said and blog outside the box. So think about how your work is going to impact not just your project and the immediate surroundings around that immediate sphere, but think about how you can take that project and make the leap to make a difference in a larger sphere. So that's just my encouragement to you. And a lot of that involves being able to communicate your message in a way that it makes sense to patients and to the general public. So those are some skills that you can gain while you're in CCHCSP and within your local mentoring environments. So Eric's question here is, do you have any advice on engaging policymakers in issues facing children with chronic diseases? Typically, I've found policymakers are most interested in issues facing the largest number of people. It's a very important question. I also have the same question for you, because I know Eric is an IBD clinician, I'm a nephrologist, we deal with children with rare diseases. Do you have any advice on how to raise this issue with policymakers?
Yes, do your homework with policymakers that may have an interest in that. Let me give you a very clear example. First of all, on the rare disease front, I'm sure you're familiar that there is a network led through Genome Canada that does work on the genetics associated with many of these rare diseases. And they're very active. Alex McKenzie at the hospital in Ottawa is one of the prime drivers in this. I'll leave that aside for the time being. Diseases which tend to be overlooked or not paid attention to, the way to get some activity around it is to find some champions in the decision-making world who can take it on for you, champion it. Example, former MP whose child has autism, targeting that person regarding how can we help you, because you're interested, because you have a real interest in this issue, right? Finding out that your child has autism, what can be done to bring this up to a larger level at the national, regional, provincial, whatever it is, levels in terms of funding or whatever it is that you're looking for, right? So I find if you do your homework around politicians, all of whom have various interests, all of them believe that they have some expertise in health of some form or other because they're dealing with it personally. Find out what that is. You find out what that is, and you can have some champions fairly quickly.
On to Scott Ramsey. Hi, Paul. Thanks so much for your talk. Building off Susan's question, you speak of understanding how government works. Is there something specific you can refer us to understand this at a federal, provincial, local level? Or is this something that must be learned with experience? So we are researchers, we're academics in universities. Tell us how we can learn about government, how it works.
Well, first of all, talk to your local MP. Everybody has a local MP, for starters. And there are organizations, by the way, that provide guidance or seminars around how government works. There's an Institute on Governance based in Ottawa that does this on a regular basis. They do seminars, webinars on how government works in various ways. But I think the best advice I can give you is talk to your local MP about what it is they're doing and how they're trying to influence decisions within their own respective, or your MPP, if you're in the provincial context, or your local municipal council member. You'd be surprised the number of people who are really interested these days in the public health response and how to do it properly around all of these issues, right? So I think you could get a captive audience by talking to them directly.
Any other questions from the group? So Megan begs, it seems that there is an increased focus on return on investment of science, including fundamental research, but we're not always great at predicting what will happen next, as you spoke about. Do you think that the COVID pandemic will alter views or increase value on basic science?
Short answer, yes. Incidentally, there's a statement that was just released by the G7 Science Academies last 3 weeks ago on basic research and why it's important. It's worth reading because the Canadian Royal Society of Canada is one of the signatories of this, making the argument for why it is that basic science remains critical. And by the way, there's a wonderful essay called On the Usefulness of Useless Knowledge, which was written in 1939 by the then incoming director of the Princeton Institute for Advanced Studies. It's a brilliant essay making the case as to why it is so-called useless knowledge is very useful. And it does make the case for why basic research is very important. And by the way, just a small plug for me, the little book that I just co-wrote with Agnes Hertzberg about her father, the Nobel laureate, Gerhard Hertzberg, is all about the value of basic science and basic research in today's world. So you can have a look at that, those essays and speeches that he wrote, some of them which are very, very timely and very relevant today.
We can certainly share the citation for that book for those who are interested. Paul, I have another question for you. So, but I can't judge the audience because everyone's got their video off. But you're part of the MyTax organization. Could you tell us what the science policy fellows do in that organization? Because what I would like for our trainees to think about, again, thinking outside the box, many of them may be at a level where they can make a leap to a different sector or a domain that, across a bar that traditionally we may not cross, or thinking outside the box, really. So if you can give us some information about that, it may tweak someone to think about another opportunity.
Yeah, it's a great program, and it tries to basically accomplish two things. One, bring young early career researchers into government to work on a particular area that a department or an agency of the government is trying to address. And two, provide that government department and agency new blood in trying to understand what is going on with the field of research today in terms of the latest science. So it's a great program. It's into its 5th cohort. It's a very competitive process. You have to apply, and there's applications available once a year. Government departments have to submit a project that they want to get done by one of these MyTax fellows, and then they screen through the list of candidates. They pick 1 or 2, and this candidate is hired with salary to work on a particular project. The cohort itself is now, as I mentioned, into its 5th learning experiment. So they're now exchanging. There's now creating a network of MyTax science policy fellows. I can put you in touch with a number of them, but they're worth talking to about how you do this, how you can apply, what are the lessons learned. They've just done an evaluation of the MyTax Science Policy Fellowship program. Overall, very good. They have a model out in BC. The BC government has tried it. Quebec is now looking at it. So the Quebec government, the BC government, but so it's starting to grow. So I'm happy to, anybody who's interested, I'd be happy to provide them with whatever further information they might want on the fellowship program. But it's copied from the US program. There's a US program which has been running for many, many years, where they have these fellows in these departments of the US government. Incredibly effective way of introducing science into public policy and partnering with it.
Yeah, so I encourage everybody to consider that as a potential opportunity, and we can certainly provide the information for the application process, etc. That's awesome. I know we're approaching the hour. We are recording this session and will be posted online shortly. I wanted to just take 1 minute to ask if there are any final questions. If not, I want to make some concluding remarks. Anyone brave enough to unmute themselves, ask one final question, or put it in the chat box? Okay, should I take the 22-second pause? That's a long time,
Susan, can I just add very quickly before you close that for anyone on the line, I do a lot of mentoring, and I'm perfectly happy to respond to anybody offline with references, whatever it is you may be looking for. They can send me an email. I'm happy to do that. Sorry.
Awesome. Thanks, Paul. So we want to thank you very much for your time today and for bringing us this thought-provoking seminar. I just wanted to make one comment to our trainees, is that I'm reflecting on my own early career differentiation stages. At that time, thinking about intersecting with government and policy was far from my mind. So I want each of you to take your time building your research program, but remember, you're going to be the leaders of tomorrow. You're going to be the health research leaders of tomorrow. So I want you to take some of these thoughts and put them in your mind and look for opportunities to talk to policymakers. It may be at your local MLA level, your provincial government, your health authority, and then in time, you will be called upon to some of those more positions, but you would have generated the knowledge and the understanding in your early career days to handle that transition when you come upon it. So the fact that we don't have a ton of questions right now, I think it assures me that you are thinking about it, and in due time, well, with us having seeded your thoughts, you will come upon and seize the opportunity. So I encourage you all to do that. With that, I want to thank everybody for attending. We're